fourth dimension is consciousness itself, is aliveness itself, beingness itself. Everything that we see and experience are reflections, movements, changes happening in the world of shadows. There is no separate individual. There is no separate you. There is no separate me. We have this overwhelming feeling of individual identity. Where does this come from? It comes from consciousness, because consciousness has this experience of totality, because it is a totality. Because it's a totality, it experiences itself as a totality through everything. But the creature that is in that altered state assumes that its totality is being created through some mysterious biological process, and it's happening in the body. Because for it, identification with the body is absolute. Although consciousness is what is projecting the body as the shadow, for an altered state, it is the other way around. It sees the body as the creator of consciousness, because it does not know where else to put consciousness. It cannot put it outside. It does not understand a higher dimension. There's no language that describes consciousness accurately as a higher dimension. And we have not mathematically formulated this higher dimension. It's not a part of our equations. We don't study it in school. We don't hear it anywhere. So naturally, we assume that it's got to be something that is being generated in the brain. And we are not even sure. It might be there, it might not be there. This is what happens when thoughts cloud a perceptual center of consciousness. Consciousness itself can become hidden. Just like you can walk into a room, a dark room, and lock yourself. Outside it can be bright and sunny. But perceptually you are in darkness. In exactly the same way, consciousness is always bright and sunny, is always watchful, is always complete. But you can be perceptually blocked from the direct experience of consciousness. That is what an altered state of consciousness is. It is a disturbance that has clouded the direct perception of consciousness. Once we understand that the fundamental nature of reality is not space, but a mind, and it is not local. This mind is not inside the body. This observer is not inside the head. Then we can explain both quantum mechanics and gravity. The observer effect itself can explain everything, because now there is no place where this observer is not there. Now you can ask the question, how is it that we have been making all our calculations and understanding gravity, understanding time, with such a fundamental thing missing, we not knowing that consciousness is the fourth dimension? How did we go to moon? How are we able to do all these things? Well, we are able to do it mathematically. Consciousness has been included in our equations and we didn't even know it. We know it as light. Light is a universal constant. Surprisingly, it is denoted by the symbol C. Of course, it has nothing to do with consciousness, but once we understand what light is, we'll see it has to be C, not only a small c, it has to be a big C. We need to be calling light the universal constant of consciousness. Because what is light? What is speed of light? Speed of light is nothing but speed of perception. Why is it a constant? Because there is only one perceiver. Because consciousness itself is the perceiver, the speed at which something is being perceived is always the same. It can never be changed. So much so that even time distorts to allow for the speed of perception to be the same. Space itself distorts. Our three-dimensional world itself says, I will even disappear. I will twist and turn and disappear, but I cannot touch this perception. I cannot break the speed limit of light. For a long time, we've been wondering why light has to travel at a particular speed. We have our own calculations. We say, well, light travels at the speed of light because it has no mass. And anything that has mass cannot travel at the speed of light. Well, this is just saying the same thing in another way. This is like saying, well, light travels at the speed of light because it travels at the speed of light. Or light travels at the speed of light because other things cannot travel at the speed of light. This is not saying anything about light. And it's in Einstein's equation, E is equal to mc squared. And that is where it most fittingly sits in the conversion of energy and mass. We've been saying E is equal to mc squared. Energy can be converted to mass can be converted to energy. We just need a constant, which is speed of light. But we have never understood why the speed of light should be the constant. Of course, the explanation is this is the fastest anything can travel in our universe. Information cannot travel faster than the speed of light because that is the limit. It is there in that equation, but it doesn't explain it. Now look at that equation from the point of view of consciousness. It becomes a quantum mechanical equation. E, energy, is nothing but thoughts. The primary energy, before it is manifest as mass, is a thought. These are thoughts. Now thoughts, when perceived, speed of light is speed of perception. C, when thoughts are perceived, they become mass. Einstein's equation is not just saying energy can be converted to mass, it is actually saying by the observer effect, by perception, superpositioned wave function of thoughts can collapse into a three-dimensional body of mass. Einstein's equation is also a quantum mechanical equation. And we have never looked at it like this. The equation has been there. We've been using it. It is the same equation that we use to understand the fundamental nature of reality at the smallest levels, in the particle colliders. It's the same equation we use in creating nuclear energy, in creating atomic bombs. But we have never understood what exactly this means. Even Einstein could not have imagined that this speed of light is actually perception itself. Even he could not have envisioned that this thing can actually be consciousness. Because for us, light has been something very physical. Now we know even a single photon of light can collapse a wave function. A single photon of light. Why? Because it is not a photon of light, it is the smallest possible sample size of perception. That is why the wave function is collapsed. Put this together, we will get our grand unifying theory. It is consciousness that can unify quantum mechanics and general relativity. And it does it without any contradictions. It does it without the necessity to add infinite number of additional dimensions, complicated calculations, nothing. Just understanding what a dimension is, moving from the lower dimension to the higher dimension systematically. Of course, this is extraordinarily difficult. In fact, no matter how we try, it is impossible for us to envision the higher dimension correctly. One of the reasons I'm able to talk in terms of this progression from lower dimension to higher dimension is because for me, this higher dimension came as an intuitive understanding of the fundamental nature of reality. It came from deep meditation. 10 years of meditation, for me, consciousness being an independent, separate entity from mind and body was the most obvious fact. I only had to study the language science is using to be able to express it. I can see why we have not been able to do it any other way. Because we are three-dimensional creatures who think in time, who think in space. We cannot think in consciousness. We cannot think in terms of totality. We cannot think in terms of an entity that can be everywhere at all times and be watchful and it not being generated in the brain. That's our limitation. But either ways, whether you go from bottom up or you come from up down, once you understand, it is not even necessary to exactly understand the process. Where did this come from to me? It's not necessary. The important thing is, can we understand it? From where we are, can we understand our lower dimensions correctly? That describes our dimension. And can we extrapolate this to the higher dimension without bringing in our limitations, our dimensional limitations, which is restricted to 3? Once we are able to see that it is impossible for this higher dimensional entity to exist without being conscious, once we write down the fundamental properties of the 4th dimension, we have to conclude that this thing has to be conscious, because it is not even trying to be conscious. It is not even trying to know its own totality. There is nothing other than totality. All the points are completely visible at all times to every other point, which means there are no separate points at all in this entity because there is no space, which means totality is its very nature. Consciousness is a very property of this realm. There is no need to explain where consciousness is coming from. You, in fact, have to explain in the lower dimensions why things are not conscious. What is blocking consciousness? That is the easier way to understand. In our three-dimensional world, it is so easy. Put 2 dots on a sheet of paper. They cannot be conscious of each other because they are separated by space, which is something entirely different from them. A point is a point, but space is a lack of point. Now the question is, how will this point travel through this lack of point, come out of its own existence and perceive a point that is like it on the other side? It's just not possible. So these 2 points are completely cut off. But in the higher dimension, there is no space, which means this point does not have to put any effort to know the other point because both the points are together. The only problem with this is imagination. We cannot imagine this. If we try to imagine, it's like, how can 2 points be at the same place? Yes, that's consciousness. That is the nature of the higher realm. There is no limitation. The entire volume of this higher dimensional space can be sitting on a single point because there is no limitation of space. That is what consciousness is. It is a totality experiencing itself as a totality. For us, it is a matter of understanding the fundamental properties of this realm. It is not about trying to explain where consciousness is being generated from. Consciousness cannot be generated. It is an existential signature of totality. It can only exist in the fourth dimension the way it is existing. It cannot be created in the brain. It cannot be created in the lab. It is impossible for a machine to become conscious. All the fear of artificial intelligence becoming self-aware and taking over the world, completely unwarranted. They will always be three-dimensional shadows created by three-dimensional beings who are actually four-dimensional. They don't even know it. The difference between a super intelligent robot and a human being is the difference between a dot and the entire universe. A human being, because he's rooted in consciousness, he represents the totality of consciousness. Whereas this machine, no matter how intelligent it is, it represents one shadow. There is no comparison at all. The fear that some machine will take over, replace us, is completely unnecessary. Once we understand who we are subjectively, what consciousness is, we'll know it is next to impossible for consciousness to simply arise as a product of complication. That is not what consciousness is. Consciousness is a totally different entity which has to be understood as a totality. And we cannot understand it by being stuck in our three-dimensional thinking. And consciousness unifies everything. It gives you the observer. It gives you the space for superposition of waves. If you can explain these two things, then how hard is it to explain quantum tunneling? How is it that a particle is able to break an energy barrier and appear on the other side at exactly the same time, instantaneously? Well, it's obvious this particle is always there. What you are seeing as a particle is not even a particle. When you're not watching it, it's a wave that is everywhere at the same time. So depending on how you're watching, where you're watching from, it's either on this side or that side. It is the observer that is collapsing the wave function this way or that way. It's the same with entanglement. And once the observer projects the shadow, because this observer is a totality, it can project one small object, it can project a grain of sand with its space and time component, or it can project an entire galaxy. So small and the big come together. And gravity is simply the distortion in the perceptual space-time fabric which doesn't exist when there is no distortion. Space-time fabric itself is a distorted fabric. When you go to the smallest of scales, where mass is negligible, there is no distortion of space. And when there is no distortion of space, we should not be talking in terms of gravity. At quantum levels, there is no need to worry about gravity. And just because you're not explaining gravity at the quantum level doesn't mean there is something fundamentally wrong with quantum mechanics. In fact, it is unable to explain gravity because gravity doesn't exist. It is not a real thing. Space-time fabric itself doesn't exist. It is a perceptual fabric that comes into the picture as a result of observer effect. When there is no observer effect, when there is no projection of shadows, there is just the fourth dimension.